In philosophy, qualia are individual instances of subjective, conscious experience. The term ʻkweɪliə derives from the Latin neuter plural form of the Latin adjective qualis, meaning of what sort, or of what kind. Examples of qualia include the pain of a headache, the taste of wine, or the perceived redness of an evening sky. As qualitative characters of sensation, qualia stand in contrast to propositional attitudes. Daniel Dennett, American philosopher and cognitive scientist, regards qualia as an unfamiliar term for something that could not be more familiar to each of us. The ways things seem to us. Erwin Schrödinger, the famous physicist, had this counter-materialist take. The sensation of color cannot be accounted for by the physicist's subjective picture of light waves. Could the physiologist account for it? If he had fuller knowledge than he has of the processes in the retina and the nervous processes set up by them in the optical nerve bundles and in the brain? I do not think so. Much of the debate over their importance hinges on the definition of the term, and various philosophers emphasize or deny the existence of certain features of qualia. As such, the nature and existence of qualia remain controversial. Definitions. There are many definitions of qualia, which have changed over time. One of the simpler, broader definitions is the what it is like character of mental states. The way it feels to have mental states such as pain, seeing red, smelling a rose, etc. Clarence Irving Lewis, in his book Mind and the World Order, was the first to use the term qualia in its generally agreed upon modern sense. There are recognizable qualitative characters of the given, which may be repeated in different experiences, and are thus a sort of universals. I call these qualia, but although such qualia are universals, in the sense of being recognized from one to another experience, they must be distinguished from the properties of objects. Confusion of these two is characteristic of many historical conceptions, as well as of current essence theories. The quale is directly intuited, given, and is not the subject of any possible error because it is purely subjective. Frank Jackson later defined qualia as certain features of the bodily sensations especially, but also of certain perceptual experiences, which no amount of purely physical information includes. Daniel Dennett identifies 4 properties that are commonly ascribed to qualia. According to these, qualia are ineffable, that is, they cannot be communicated or apprehended by any other means than direct experience; intrinsic, that is, they are non-relational properties, which do not change depending on the experience's relation to other things; private, that is, all interpersonal comparisons of qualia are systematically impossible; directly or immediately apprehensible in consciousness, that is, to experience a quale is to know one experiences a quale, and to know all there is to know about that quale. If qualia of this sort exist, then a normally sighted person who sees red would be unable to describe the experience of this perception in such a way that a listener who has never experienced color will be able to know everything there is to know about that experience. Though it is possible to make an analogy, such as, red looks hot, or to provide a description of the conditions under which the experience occurs, such as, it's the color you see when light of 700 nanometer wavelength is directed at you. Supporters of this kind of qualia contend that such a description is incapable of providing a complete description of the experience. Another way of defining qualia is as raw feels. A raw feel is a perception in and of itself, considered entirely in isolation from any effect it might have on behavior and behavioral disposition. In contrast, a cooked feel is that perception seen as existing in terms of its effects. For example, the perception of the taste of wine is an ineffable, raw feel, while the experience of warmth or bitterness caused by that taste of wine would be a cooked feel. A cooked feel is not qualia. According to an argument put forth by Sol Kripke in his paper, Identity and Necessity, One key consequence of the claim that such things as raw fields can be meaningfully discussed, that qualia exist, is that it leads to the logical possibility of two entities exhibiting identical behavior in all ways despite one of them entirely lacking qualia, while very few ever claim that such an entity, called a philosophical zombie, actually exists. The mere possibility is claimed to be sufficient to refute physicalism. Arguments for the existence of qualia. Since it is by definition impossible to convey qualia verbally, it is also impossible to demonstrate them directly in an argument, so a more tangential approach is needed. Arguments for qualia generally come in the form of thought experiments designed to lead one to the conclusion that qualia exist. The "what's it like to be" argument, although it does not actually mention the word qualia. Thomas Nagel's paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" is often cited in debates over qualia. Nagel argues that consciousness has an essentially subjective character, a what it is like aspect. He states that an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it is like. For the organism, Nagel also suggests that the subjective aspect of the mind may not ever be sufficiently accounted for by the objective methods of reductionistic science. He claims that, if we acknowledge that a physical theory of mind must account for the subjective character of experience, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue how this could be done. Furthermore, he states that it seems unlikely that any physical theory of mind can be contemplated until more thought has been given to the general problem of subjective and objective. The inverted spectrum argument. The inverted spectrum thought experiment, originally developed by John Locke, invites us to imagine that we wake up one morning and find that for some unknown reason all the colors in the world have been inverted. Furthermore, we discover that no physical changes have occurred in our brains or bodies that would explain this phenomenon. Supporters of the existence of qualia argue that since we can imagine this happening without contradiction, it follows that we are imagining a change in a property that determines the way things look to us, but that has no physical basis. In more detail, metaphysical identity holds of necessity. If something is possibly false, it is not necessary. It is conceivable that qualia could have a different relationship to physical brain states. If it is conceivable, then it is possible. Since it is possible for qualia to have a different relationship with physical brain states, they cannot be identical to brain states. Therefore, qualia are non-physical. The argument thus claims that if we find the inverted spectrum plausible, we must admit that qualia exist. Some philosophers find it absurd that an armchair argument can prove something to exist, and the detailed argument does involve a lot of assumptions about conceivability and possibility, which are open to criticism. Perhaps it is not possible for a given brain state to produce anything other than a given quale in our universe, and that is all that matters. The idea that an inverted spectrum would be undetectable in practice is also open to criticism on more scientific grounds. There is an actual experiment, albeit somewhat obscure, that parallels the inverted spectrum argument. Carl H. Pribram, Emeritus Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at Stanford University, had some of his students perform an experiment in which they wore special prism glasses that cause the external world to appear upside down. After a few days of continually wearing the glasses, an adaptation occurred and the external world appeared righted. When the glasses were removed, the external world again appeared inverted. After a similar period, perception of the external world returned to their normal, perceptual state. If this argument provides indicia that qualia exist, it does not necessarily follow that they must be non-physical. because that distinction should be considered a separate epistemological issue. The zombie argument. A similar argument holds that it is conceivable that there could be physical duplicates of people, called philosophical zombies, without any qualia at all. These zombies would demonstrate outward behavior precisely similar to that of a normal human, but would not have a subjective phenomenology. It is worth noting that a necessary condition for the possibility of philosophical zombies is that there be no specific part or parts of the brain that directly give rise to qualia. The zombie can only exist if subjective consciousness is causally separate from the physical brain. The explanatory gap argument. Joseph Levine's paper Conceivability, Identity, and the explanatory gap takes up where the criticisms of conceivability arguments, such as the inverted spectrum argument and the zombie argument, leave off. Levine agrees that conceivability is flawed as a means of establishing metaphysical realities, but points out that even if we come to the metaphysical conclusion that qualia are physical, there is still an explanatory problem. While I think this materialist response is right in the end, it does not suffice to put the mind-body problem to rest. Even if conceivability considerations do not establish that the mind is in fact distinct from the body, or that mental properties are metaphysically irreducible to physical properties, still they do demonstrate that we lack an explanation of the mental in terms of the physical. However, such an epistemological or explanatory problem might indicate an underlying metaphysical issue, the non-physicality of qualia, even if not proven by conceivability arguments, is far from ruled out. In the end, we are right back where we started. The explanatory gap argument doesn't demonstrate a gap in nature, but a gap in our understanding of nature. Of course, a plausible explanation for there being a gap in our understanding of nature is that there is a genuine gap in nature. But so long as we have countervailing reasons for doubting the latter, we have to look elsewhere for an explanation of the former. The knowledge argument. In an article, Epiphenomenal Qualia, Frank Jackson offers what he calls the knowledge argument for qualia. One example runs as follows. Mary, the color scientist, knows all the physical facts about color, including every physical fact about the experience of color in other people. From the behavior a particular color is likely to elicit to the specific sequence of neurological firings that register that a color has been seen. However, she has been confined from birth to a room that is black and white, and is only allowed to observe the outside world through a black and white monitor. When she is allowed to leave the room, it must be admitted that she learns something about the color red the first time she sees it. Specifically, she learns what it is like to see that color. This thought experiment has two purposes. First, it is intended to show that qualia exist. If we agree with the thought experiment, we believe that Mary gains something after she leaves the room, that she acquires knowledge of a particular thing that she did not possess before. That knowledge, Jackson argues, is knowledge of the quale that corresponds to the experience of seeing red, and it must thus be conceded that qualia are real properties. Since there is a difference between a person who has access to a particular quale and one who does not. The second purpose of this argument is to refute the physicalist account of the mind. Specifically, the knowledge argument is an attack on the physicalist claim about the completeness of physical truths. The challenge posed to physicalism by the knowledge argument runs as follows. Before her release, Mary was in possession of all the physical information about color experiences of other people. After her release, Mary learned something about the color experiences of other people. Therefore, before her release, Mary was not in possession of all the information about other people's color experiences, even though she was in possession of all the physical information. Therefore, there are truths about other people's color experience that are not physical. Therefore, physicalism is false. First, Jackson argued that qualia are epiphenomenal, not causally efficacious with respect to the physical world. Jackson does not give a positive justification for this claim. Rather, he seems to assert it simply because it defends qualia against the classic problem of dualism. Our natural assumption would be that qualia must be causally efficacious in the physical world. But some would ask how we could argue for their existence if they did not affect our brains. If qualia are to be non-physical properties, some argue that it is almost impossible to imagine how they could have a causal effect on the physical world. By redefining qualia as epiphenomenal, Jackson attempts to protect them from the demand of playing a causal role. Later, however, he rejected epiphenomenalism. This, he argues, is due to the fact that when Mary first sees red, she says, "Wow," so it must be Mary's qualia that caused her to say, "Wow." This contradicts epiphenomenalism. Since the Mary's room thought experiment seems to create this contradiction, there must be something wrong with it. This is often referred to as that there must be a reply.